Welcome back to our dive into the most thrilling fan-made versions of Invincible. If you haven't seen the other parts, go check them out for more epic twists. Today in part 4, we're exploring fresh takes on Mark Grayson's story that flip heroism, family, and identity in bold new ways. Buckle up, Margaret Grayson. What if the roles were completely reversed? What if Earth's greatest threat came not from a Viltrumite father, but from a Viltrumite mother? Margaret Grayson represents one of the most fascinating gender-swapped variants in the multiverse. A timeline where traditional expectations are shattered and heroism takes on an entirely different meaning. In this universe, the invasion of Earth was assigned not to Nolan Grayson, but to Devora, a fierce Viltrumite warrior whose reputation for ruthless efficiency made her the Empire's perfect choice for preparing humanity's conquest. Unlike the canon timeline where Omni-Man's mission was long-term infiltration, Devora was sent with explicit instructions to weaken Earth's defenses systematically, gathering intelligence on human capabilities while positioning herself for the eventual full-scale invasion. Devora arrived on Earth with the cold calculation that defined all Viltrumite operations. She studied human society, analyzed their military capabilities, and identified key infrastructure targets. But then something unexpected happened. Something that the Viltrumite Empire had never anticipated in their millennia of conquest. She met Nolan, a human man whose gentle strength and unwavering moral compass represented everything that Viltrumite society had bred out of their people. The attraction wasn't immediate. Devora initially saw Nolan as a useful asset, someone who could provide her with deeper insights into human psychology and social structures. But as she spent more time observing human behavior through his eyes, she began to understand concepts that had been foreign to her warrior upbringing. Compassion, self-sacrifice, the value of individual life over collective strength. When Margaret was born, Devora experienced something that no amount of Viltrumite conditioning had prepared her for: unconditional love for a being she had created rather than conquered. This tiny hybrid child represented the perfect fusion of Viltrumite power and human emotion, and Devora found herself torn between her mission and her maternal instincts. From the moment Margaret could walk, Devora began training her daughter in Viltrumite combat techniques. But unlike the brutal conditioning that most Viltrumite children endured, Margaret's training was tempered by genuine affection and care. Devora taught her daughter to fight not because she was weak, but because she was precious, worth protecting, and strong enough to protect others. When Margaret's powers manifested at age 14, the mother-daughter training sessions intensified dramatically. Margaret possessed incredible natural talent, her hybrid physiology granting her strength that rivaled pure-blood Viltrumites while maintaining the emotional complexity that made her father's species remarkable. The bond between mother and daughter grew stronger with each training session, creating a partnership that was both deadly and beautiful to behold. But as Margaret grew more powerful, Devora's internal conflict intensified. Every technique she taught her daughter, every strategic lesson she imparted, brought them closer to the day when Margaret would have to choose between her Viltrumite heritage and her human connections. Devora began to understand that her mission wasn't just about conquering Earth. It was about potentially destroying everything she had come to love. The years following Margaret's power development marked a period of dangerous procrastination for Devora. She found excuses to delay her reports to the Empire, invented obstacles that required more time to overcome, and gradually began to hope that perhaps her mission could be forgotten. But the Viltrumite Empire doesn't forget, and it certainly doesn't forgive failure. When the scout team arrived on Earth, their message was simple and brutal. Complete the mission immediately, or face consequences that would extend to both Devora and her hybrid daughter. The Viltrumites had monitored Devora's communications and noticed the suspicious gaps in her intelligence reports. They knew she had been compromised by human emotion, and they were prepared to eliminate both her and Margaret as examples to other agents who might consider similar betrayals. The confrontation with the scout team revealed the true depth of Devora's transformation. When faced with the choice between her duty to the Empire and her love for her family, she chose love, but not passively. She fought the scouts with a ferocity that surprised even her, defending not just Margaret and Nolan, but the entire planet she'd been sent to conquer. Margaret witnessed her mother's defection with a mixture of pride and terror. She saw Devora abandon everything she had been trained to value: duty, honor, racial supremacy, in favor of principles that the Viltrumite Empire considered weaknesses. But Margaret also understood that this wasn't weakness at all. It was the strongest choice her mother could make. The aftermath of the scout team's destruction left the Grayson family with a terrible knowledge. The full Viltrumite invasion was coming, and they were now humanity's primary targets. Devora's betrayal would be seen as the ultimate insult to Viltrumite honor, and the Empire would send their most brutal forces to make examples of the traitors. Margaret's vow to become strong enough to defeat the Viltrumites wasn't born from teenage bravado. It was a mature understanding of the responsibility she now carried. As the only being on Earth with both Viltrumite powers and knowledge of their tactics, she represented humanity's best hope for survival. But she also knew that defeating the Empire would likely mean killing members of her own species, including possible relatives she had never met. Devora's decision to enlist the help of the Guardians of the Globe marked a complete reversal of her original mission. The woman who had been sent to identify and eliminate Earth's defenders now worked tirelessly to strengthen them. She provided tactical intelligence about Viltrumite combat techniques, revealed the Empire's strategic weaknesses, and helped design countermeasures that could level the playing field between human technology and Viltrumite biology. The mother-daughter combat team that emerged from this preparation was unlike anything the universe had ever seen. Margaret's raw power combined with Devora's centuries of combat experience created a fighting force that was both strategically brilliant and emotionally driven. They fought not just with their bodies, but with their hearts, protecting a world that had given them something the Viltrumite Empire never could, a family worth dying for. Margaret's relationship with this universe's version of Adam Eve, a variant of Evan, but not the same as the fused being from our previous episode, adds another layer of complexity to her story. This relationship represents Margaret's connection to her human side, her ability to form bonds that transcend species and ideology. It shows that despite her incredible power and alien heritage, she remains fundamentally capable of the love and vulnerability that define humanity at its best. The growth in Margaret's abilities has been exponential, but it's her emotional development that makes her truly formidable. She possesses the strategic mind of a Viltrumite general combined with the moral compass of someone raised with human values. When she and Devora fight together, they represent the perfect synthesis of power and purpose, strength, guided by love rather than conquest. Margaret Grayson proves that heroism isn't about the circumstances of your birth or the expectations placed upon you, it's about the choices you make when those expectations conflict with your values. She and her mother chose to be something better than what they were designed to be, and in doing so, they became exactly what their adopted world needed them to be. Mullet Mark. Sometimes the smallest decisions can lead to the darkest paths. Mullet Mark represents one of the most tragically comedic variants in the multiverse, a timeline where vanity, insecurity, and poor grooming choices combine to create a supervillain whose origin story is as ridiculous as it is heartbreaking. In this universe, everything starts exactly as it does in the canon timeline, until Mark makes one crucial mistake. When Amber Bennett tells him his haircut looks whack as hell, Mark doesn't just feel embarrassed, he feels his entire world crumble. This wasn't just a casual criticism about his appearance. It was a direct attack on his self-image, his confidence, and everything he thought he knew about looking cool. Mark had been absolutely convinced that his low taper fade was the pinnacle of style. After all, Tyler Ninja Blevins, had said it was still huge and awesome, and if a Fortnite legend approved, how could it be wrong? Mark had invested not just money, but genuine pride in this haircut, seeing it as part of his identity as a modern, relevant teenager. The breakup with Amber hits Mark harder than any supervillain's punch ever could. It's not just romantic rejection, it's a fundamental questioning of his judgment, his taste, and his understanding of what makes someone attractive or desirable. In a universe where Mark already struggles with feeling different due to his powers, this criticism of his appearance becomes a devastating blow to his already fragile teenage self-esteem. But life has a way of surprising us, and despite his zero aura and devastating haircut defeat, Eve somehow sees past Mark's questionable grooming choices. Maybe it's his genuine heart, maybe it's the way he tries so hard to do the right thing, or maybe she just has a soft spot for guys with tragic fashion sense. Whatever the reason, Eve and Mark fall genuinely, deeply in love. Their relationship blossoms into something beautiful and authentic. They build a life together, get married, and start a family. For For years, Mark thinks he's left his hair-related trauma behind. He's found someone who loves him regardless of his appearance, someone who sees beyond superficial concerns to the hero he truly is. He begins to believe that maybe, just maybe, the Amber incident was just one person's opinion and not a universal truth about his worthiness. Then the future Eve arrives, and Mark's carefully constructed confidence crumbles like a house of cards in a hurricane. This older, more experienced version of his wife brings a message that shatters his world. Even Eve will eventually realize the low taper fade is whack-aff and will divorce him, taking their children in the process. The future Eve explains that this realization is inevitable, that no amount of love can overcome the fundamental aesthetic failure that is Mark's chosen hairstyle. The psychological impact of this revelation cannot be overstated. Mark realizes that his worst fears are true, that everyone, eventually, will see through to his fundamental lack of coolness. The Amber incident wasn't an isolated event. It was a preview of his entire future. No matter how many people he saves, no matter how much good he does in the world, he will always be the guy with the terrible haircut. Future Eve's warning about the mullet is meant as a kindness. She's trying to save him from a dark path that leads to villainy and universal condemnation. She explains that the mullet represents Mark's descent into bitter anger, his rejection of society's standards in favor of a hairstyle that's even more universally mocked than the low taper fade. She urges him to choose a different cut, something that won't trigger his transformation into a notorious supervillain. But Mark's psychological state has deteriorated beyond the point where rational advice can help. The knowledge that Eve will eventually leave him recreates the exact trauma of the Amber breakup, but with even higher stakes. This isn't just about losing a girlfriend, it's about losing his wife, his children, his entire future happiness. The pain is so intense that Mark's mind breaks, and he decides that if society's gonna reject him anyway, he might as well reject society first. Mark's refusal to listen to future Eve's warnings marks the point of no return. His decision to grow out his hair becomes an act of defiance against a world that has never appreciated him. He doesn't just want a new hairstyle, he wants to become someone completely different, someone who doesn't care about society's approval because he's too powerful to need it. The months Mark spends growing out his hair represent his gradual descent into darkness. Each day, his resentment grows along with his follicles. He begins to see every slight, every criticism, every moment of social awkwardness as evidence of humanity's fundamental cruelty. He starts planning not just his new look, but his new identity as someone who takes what he wants rather than hoping for acceptance. When Mark finally visits the barber and requests the mullet, it's not just a grooming decision, it's a ritual transformation. The barber, unaware that he's participating in the birth of a supervillain, carefully crafts the hairstyle that will define an era of terror. As each strand falls to the floor, Mark sheds his identity as a hero, trying to fit in, and embraces his new role as a villain who stands apart. The mullet itself becomes Mark's symbol of rebellion against conventional standards. It's objectively terrible. Everyone can see that, but that's exactly the point. Mark is announcing to the world that he no longer cares about their opinions, their standards, or their approval. He's become powerful enough to impose his own aesthetic vision on reality, and if people don't like it, they can suffer the consequences. Eve's breakup with Mark after he gets the mullet fulfills the prophecy, but also triggers his final transformation. Instead of accepting responsibility for his choices, Mark gaslights everyone around him. He spreads the narrative that Eve was a thought who never truly appreciated him, that their breakup was mutual, and that the mullet is actually super cool. It emphatically is not. His ability to maintain these obvious lies through sheer force of personality and power demonstrates how completely he's abandoned truth in favor of self-serving fiction. The tragedy of Mullet Mark is that his descent into villainy stems from genuine insecurity and pain, but his response to that pain makes him increasingly impossible to help or redeem. He becomes the very thing that society feared he might be, not because of his powers, but because of his inability to handle criticism and rejection with maturity. Mullet Mark serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of self-acceptance and the dangers of tying your self-worth to external validation. He shows us that even the most powerful beings can be brought low by vanity and insecurity, and that sometimes the most ridiculous origins can lead to the most serious consequences. Lizard League Mark. What happens when humanity's greatest potential hero is raised by its most primitive villains? Lizard League Mark represents one of the most disturbing role reversals in the multiverse, a timeline where nurture completely overwhelms nature, creating a Mark Grayson who embodies everything the original hero fought against. In this twisted reality, Mark isn't born to the Grayson family at all. Instead, he emerges as the offspring of Queen Lizard, the matriarch of one of Earth's most savage criminal organizations. But this isn't a simple adoption or kidnapping scenario. Mark is literally born from Queen Lizard through some unholy union that defies both biology and common sense, marking him as something fundamentally different from either pure human or pure Viltrumite heritage. The Lizard League in this universe isn't just a gang of mutant criminals. They're a death cult devoted to Ouroboros, an ancient snake god whose worship predates human civilization. Their criminal activities serve a dual purpose: acquiring resources for their organization and gathering sacrificial victims for their barbaric rituals. Queen Lizard doesn't lead them simply for power or money, but because she genuinely believes that Ouroboros grants strength to those willing to feed it the blood of heroes. Mark's childhood is a nightmare of indoctrination and violence. From his earliest memories, he knows only a life of crime, where strength is measured by brutality and success is defined by how much suffering you can inflict on others. He watches Queen Lizard torture captured heroes, sees his family perform ritual sacrifices, and learns to view normal human society as prey rather than people deserving protection. The worship of Ouroboros permeates every aspect of Mark's upbringing. He's taught that the snake god rewards those who embrace their predatory nature, that civilization is a weakness that separates humans from their true potential, and that heroes are the ultimate enemy because they try to impose order on a world that should be ruled by the strong consuming the weak. These aren't just criminal philosophies, they're religious beliefs that shape Mark's fundamental understanding of reality. Queen Lizard's attempts to channel Ouroboros' power through various League members always fail, but her faith never wavers. She believes that the god is simply waiting for the right vessel, someone worthy of becoming its mortal avatar. When she looks at Mark, her strange, powerful child who seems to possess abilities beyond those of normal humans, she sees the answer to her prayers. The battle with the Guardians of the Globe that critically injures Queen Lizard represents a turning point not just for her, but for the entire Lizard League's destiny. As she lies dying, she doesn't rage against her fate or beg for mercy. Instead, she sees this as the perfect opportunity to finally prove her devotion to Ouroboros. Her death will serve a purpose greater than her life ever could. The ritual Queen Lizard performs with her dying breath is unlike anything the League has attempted before. Instead of trying to summon Ouroboros' power into a reluctant host, she offers her own life force as a bridge between the mortal and divine realms. Her death becomes a sacrifice that opens a permanent connection between Mark and the ancient snake god. The transformation that follows is both miraculous and horrifying. Ouroboros' power floods into Mark's young body, but instead of consuming or corrupting him, it enhances abilities he didn't even know he possessed. His senses become preternaturally acute, allowing him to detect fear, aggression, and weakness in others. His strength increases dramatically, though not to Viltrumite levels. Instead, it becomes more focused, more efficient, designed for hunting rather than raw destruction. The healing factor Mark gains isn't like typical superhuman regeneration. It's more serpentine in nature, allowing him to shed damaged tissue like a snake sheds skin, emerging renewed but fundamentally changed by each recovery. His blood becomes venomous, capable of killing with a single drop or inducing paralysis, hallucinations, or excruciating pain depending on his emotional state during the bite. Perhaps most disturbing is Mark's ability to contort and rearrange his organs and bones at will. This makes him incredibly difficult to injure in any permanent way, as he can shift vital organs away from incoming attacks or reshape his skeletal structure to escape from seemingly impossible restraints. It also makes him a uniquely terrifying opponent, as his body can assume configurations that defy human anatomy. At age 14, Mark becomes the new leader of the Lizard League, but his leadership style is completely different from Queen Lizard's. Where she relied on fear and tradition, Mark leads through supernatural charisma enhanced by his connection to Ouroboros. League members don't just follow him, they worship him as the living embodiment of their god. Under Mark's leadership, the Lizard League's criminal activities become far more sophisticated and deadly. His enhanced senses allow him to predict police movements, his strategic thinking, enhanced by Ouroboros' ancient wisdom, makes their heists nearly impossible to counter, and his supernatural presence attracts new followers who see him as something beyond human. The most horrifying aspect of Mark's evolution is his development of the ability to consume other beings to increase his power. This isn't just killing. It's a complete absorption of his victim's life force, knowledge, and abilities. When he devours Duplicate, he doesn't just gain her memories, he gains the ability to create multiple versions of himself. Black Samson's consumption grants him enhanced durability and strength. Rexplode's death gives him explosive capabilities. Each hero Mark consumes becomes part of him in the most literal sense possible. Their personalities, memories, and abilities are integrated into his consciousness, but twisted through the lens of Ouroboros' influence. He doesn't just gain their powers, he gains corrupted versions that serve his predatory nature rather than any heroic purpose. The influence of Ouroboros transforms Mark into something that transcends traditional categories of hero or villain. He becomes a force of nature driven by hunger, obsession, and ego, but also by a genuine religious conviction that his actions serve a higher purpose. He doesn't see himself as evil, he sees himself as an agent of natural selection, culling the weak and consuming the strong to serve his God's will. Mark's connection to Ouroboros also grants him prophetic visions and an understanding of mystical forces that most beings can't comprehend. He can predict his enemy's strategies not through logical deduction, but through divine insight. He can manipulate supernatural energies and summon aspects of his God's power when facing particularly challenging opponents. The tragedy of Lizard League Mark is that buried somewhere within this monster is the potential for heroism that defines all Mark Grayson variants. But that potential has been so thoroughly corrupted by his upbringing and supernatural influence that it serves only to make him more dangerous. His natural charisma becomes a tool for manipulation, his strategic intelligence serves predatory purposes, and his physical capabilities are used to hunt rather than protect. Lizard League Mark represents the ultimate corruption of potential, a being who could have been humanity's greatest protector, instead becoming its most sophisticated predator. He shows us that heroism isn't inevitable, that even the strongest foundations can be corrupted if subjected to the right combination of indoctrination, supernatural influence, and environmental pressure. Lightwave Gang Mark. Lightwave Gang Mark represents a vision of tomorrow where technology has advanced beyond recognition, but humanity's capacity for cruelty has evolved alongside it, creating a world where heroes are obsolete and power belongs to those willing to take it by any means necessary. Set in the year 2236, this timeline presents an Earth that has achieved technological marvels that would seem like fantasy to contemporary observers. Cities float in the sky, energy weapons have replaced traditional firearms, and artificial intelligence handles most of the mundane tasks that once required human labor. But despite these advances, or perhaps because of them, society has become more fractured and violent than ever before. The absence of the Guardians of the Globe in this timeline isn't coincidental, it's systematic. Advanced technology has made traditional superheroism functionally obsolete. When police forces operate like military units with weapons that can level city blocks, when criminal organizations possess firepower that rivals small nations, the idea of costumed heroes fighting crime with their fists seems quaint and ineffective. This is a world where power has been democratized through technology, but that democratization has led to chaos rather than equality. Everyone has access to weapons that could kill hundreds, transportation that can cross continents in minutes, and communication systems that can coordinate complex operations across multiple time zones. The result isn't a utopia of empowered individuals, but a dystopia of warring factions, limited only by their imagination and ruthlessness. Into this chaotic world comes Nolan, following a pattern similar to his canon mission, but compressed into a much shorter time frame. His 3-year stay on Earth represents a rushed intelligence gathering operation rather than the long-term infiltration strategy employed in other timelines. The pressing conflict that calls him back to the Viltrumite Empire doesn't allow for the patient cultivation of local relationships that characterized his other assignment. The relationship Nolan forms with Mark's mother is purely transactional, a brief liaison designed to gather information about human reproduction and genetics rather than genuine emotional connection. When he learns of her pregnancy, he sees it as useful data about Viltrumite human compatibility rather than the creation of a family. His departure leaves behind not just an abandoned woman, but a complete absence of any support structure for his unborn child. Mark's mother's death during labor represents the complete failure of this society's safety net. In a world of advanced medical technology, a woman dies in childbirth not because the technology to save her doesn't exist, but because access to that technology is restricted by economic and social barriers. Her death is a symptom of a society that has advanced technologically while regressing morally. The absence of any governmental foster care system reveals the extent to which this society has abandoned collective responsibility for individual welfare. In this future, children aren't seen as investments in society's future, but as problems to be managed or resources to be exploited. Mark's abandonment by the system that should have protected him sets the stage for his transformation into everything that system fears. The nurse who initially adopts Mark represents one of the few genuinely compassionate figures in this timeline, but even her kindness is corrupted by economic necessity. When government aid fails to materialize, she's forced to make an impossible choice between her own survival and Mark's welfare. Her decision to sell him to the Lightwave Gang isn't evil. It's the desperate act of someone trying to survive in a system that has abandoned any pretense of caring for the vulnerable. The Lightwave Gang represents the logical evolution of organized crime in a technologically advanced society. They're not just criminals. They're a small army with access to military-grade equipment, sophisticated logistics networks, and the ability to operate across multiple jurisdictions with impunity. Their activities span the entire spectrum of illegal enterprise, from relatively minor property crimes to horrific violations of human dignity, like trafficking and arms dealing. Mark's rapid rise through the gang's ranks reveals both his natural talent for violence and his complete lack of moral education. Without any positive role models or ethical guidance, he develops into exactly what his environment rewards: someone willing to use extreme brutality to achieve objectives, someone who values personal survival above all other considerations, someone who sees other people as obstacles or resources rather than individuals deserving basic human dignity. The discovery of his flight powers during the failed heist represents a turning point not just for Mark, but for the entire criminal ecosystem of his region. The accidental destruction of multiple apartment buildings demonstrates the scale of power he possesses, but also the complete absence of control or responsibility that should accompany such ability. He doesn't feel guilt about the destruction. He feels pride at the advantage it gives his organization. The Lightwave Gang's decision to promote Mark to leadership based on his destructive capabilities reveals the values that define this criminal organization. They don't reward intelligence, strategic thinking, or even traditional criminal skills. They reward the capacity for violence and the willingness to use it without restraint. Mark becomes their leader not because he's the smartest or most experienced, but because he's the most dangerous. Mark's ignorance of his true origins creates a fascinating contrast with other variants who struggle with their dual heritage. He doesn't know he's part Viltrumite, doesn't understand the source of his abilities, and doesn't grapple with questions of identity or purpose. This ignorance is both liberating and tragic. It frees him from the burden of expectations, but also denies him the possibility of choosing a better path. Under Mark's leadership, the Lightwave Gang evolves from a regional criminal organization into a territorial empire. They don't just commit crimes, they establish control over entire districts, imposing their own law through force and intimidation. Mark's approach to leadership reflects his upbringing. Problems are solved through violence, loyalty is maintained through fear, and success is measured by the amount of territory and resources under their control. The extreme prejudice with which Mark rules neighboring districts reveals the complete absence of any moral constraints on his behavior. He doesn't distinguish between rival criminals and innocent civilians, between legitimate threats and minor inconveniences. Everyone who doesn't serve his interests becomes a potential target, and his superhuman abilities make resistance functionally impossible. Lightwave Gang Mark represents the darkest possible interpretation of the phrase, "power corrupts." He shows us what happens when incredible abilities are combined with complete moral abandonment, when technological advancement occurs without corresponding ethical evolution. He's not just a supervillain, he's a preview of what humanity might become if we lose sight of the values that make civilization possible. This variant serves as a warning about the importance of the social structures and moral education that we often take for granted. Without family, without community, without examples of heroism and sacrifice, even someone with the genetic potential to be humanity's greatest protector can become its greatest threat. Fat Invincible. What if superhuman power didn't come with the expectation of physical perfection? What if the weight of the world literally became a hero's greatest asset? Fat Invincible represents a bold reimagining of Mark Grayson's journey, a timeline where body image, self-acceptance, and unconventional strength collide to create a hero who defies both Viltrumite ideals and human stereotypes. In this universe, Mark's early life mirrors the canon timeline almost perfectly at first. Nolan, as Omni-Man, arrives on Earth with his conquest mission, marries Debbie, and raises Mark with stories of Viltrumite glory. But subtle differences in Mark's teenage years set everything off course. The pressures of high school hit Mark harder here. Bullying about his awkward phase body type, combined with the anxiety of waiting for his powers to manifest, leads him to find solace in food. Comics, video games, and late-night snacks become his escape. And without the immediate emergence of superhuman abilities to boost his confidence, Mark gains weight rapidly. By age 17, he's not the lean, athletic teen of other timelines. He's overweight, self-conscious, and convinced he'll never live up to his father's legendary physique. Nolan notices, of course. Viltrumites value peak physical condition as a marker of superiority, and Nolan's subtle criticisms framed as tough love only deepen Mark's insecurities. Strength isn't just about muscles, son, but you need to control your body before you can control your power, Nolan says during training sessions that Mark dreads. Debbie tries to mediate, emphasizing emotional health over appearance, but Mark internalizes the message. He's not good enough. Not for heroism, not for his heritage, and certainly not for the girls at school like Amber Bennett, who in this timeline dates someone else after Mark's low self-esteem keeps him from asking her out. The turning point comes when Mark's powers finally activate, not in a dramatic fight, but during a mundane accident. Bullied at school, Mark is shoved into a vending machine, which topples over him. Expecting pain, he's shocked when his body absorbs the impact effortlessly. His Viltrumite physiology kicks in, but with a twist. His extra body mass enhances his durability, turning his fat into a natural armor that cushions blows and stores kinetic energy like a battery. He discovers he can fly, but his larger frame allows him to generate massive momentum, crashing into threats like a living wrecking ball. Super strength, amplified by his weight, making his punches hit with the force of a freight train. Invulnerability, his layers of tissue regenerate faster, adapting to store and release energy in bursts. Mark dubs himself Fat Invincible in a moment of self-deprecating humor during his first heroic act, stopping a bank robbery by body, slamming through the wall, and pinning the criminals under his weight without harming innocents. The media latches on, turning it into a viral sensation. Some mock him as the chubby champion, but others celebrate him as a relatable hero who proves you don't need a six-pack to save the day. Social media explodes with fan art and memes, inspiring body-positive movements. Mark embraces the name, reclaiming it as a badge of honor. I'm invincible because I accept who I am, flaws and all. But heroism isn't easy. Nolan's disapproval intensifies. In Viltrumite culture, physical form reflects discipline and racial purity. A fat hybrid is an embarrassment. When Nolan reveals his true mission and attacks the Guardians of the Globe, he spares Mark, not out of love, but pity, seeing his son as too weak to even bother conquering alongside him. You've let yourself become soft, Mark. The Empire would crush you like the human weakness you embody. The betrayal hits harder here, as Mark grapples with body dysmorphia amplified by his father's words. In their brutal confrontation, Mark's size becomes his salvation. Nolan's precise strikes glance off Mark's padded frame, and Mark's counterattacks use his mass to overwhelm Nolan's agility, forcing him to flee Earth bloodied and humiliated. In the aftermath, Mark's journey of self-acceptance deepens. He teams up with Adam Eve, whose molecular manipulation powers allow her to understand bodies on a fundamental level. Their relationship blossoms differently. Eve helps Mark see his form as a strength, not a flaw. Your body isn't a limitation, Mark. It's evolved to protect you in ways mine never could. could. Together, they face threats tailored to this timeline. A villainous tech mogul promoting perfect body serums that turn people into mindless drones, or a rogue Viltrumite scout who mocks Mark's appearance before being defeated by his unorthodox tactics, like using his belly to deflect energy blasts or creating shockwaves by slamming his fists into the ground with earthquake-like force. Mark's powers evolve uniquely. His fat cells become supercharged storage units for solar energy, allowing him to go longer without recharging than other Viltrumites. He develops abilities like density shifting, where he can compress his mass for bursts of speed or expand it for a movable defense. In battles against interdimensional foes like Angstrom Levy's variants, Fat Invincible surprises enemies who underestimate him based on appearance. One variant, a lean, arrogant Mark from a perfect timeline, learns the hard way when Fat Invincible absorbs his attacks and redirects the energy in a massive belly flop that levels a city block, evacuated first, of course. Relationships add layers to his story. William Clockwell becomes his biggest supporter, helping with PR to combat fat-shaming trolls online. Amber, regretting her earlier dismissal, tries to reconnect. But Mark has grown beyond needing validation from others. His half-brother Oliver, when introduced, idolizes him not for looking like a traditional hero, but for being authentic. Even Cecil Stedman recruits him for the Global Defense Agency, valuing his resilience. In a world of chiseled jaws and capes, we need someone who can take a hit and keep smiling. The Viltrumite War tests Mark's resolve like never before. When the Empire arrives, led by Conquest, they view him as a genetic abomination, a hybrid tainted by human indulgence. Conquest taunts about Mark's weight fuel, a rage that unlocks new power levels, but Mark channels it positively, protecting Earth not through conquest, but compassion. He rallies heroes and civilians alike, proving that true strength comes from within. In a climactic battle, Mark defeats Conquest by using his mass to pin the warrior long enough for allies to deliver the finishing blow, all while quipping, "Guess I'm not so easy to move after all." Fat Invincible's growth culminates in a profound realization. Heroism isn't about fitting a mold, it's about rising above judgments, including your own. He inspires a new generation of diverse heroes, from plus-size speedsters to elderly tacticians. When Nolan eventually returns, reformed, their reconciliation is heartfelt. Nolan admits his Viltrumite ideals were flawed, and Mark's softness saved him from becoming a monster. In the end, Fat Invincible shows that power without self-love is hollow. He embodies the idea that anyone can be a hero, regardless of size, shape, or societal expectations. His story is a celebration of resilience, reminding us that the heaviest burdens often forge the strongest spirits, and that sometimes the best way to fly is to embrace every part of yourself. Markwing. In the darkest timeline, abandonment can either break a person completely or forge them into something harder than diamond. Markwing represents the path of resilience, born from betrayal. A Mark Grayson who learned to be a hero not because of his father's example, but in spite of his father's cruelty. This nightmare begins when Mark turns 13 and his powers fail to manifest on schedule. For most Viltrumites, powers emerge naturally during adolescence, but Mark's hybrid genetics create unpredictable delays that Nolan interprets as weakness or genetic failure. Instead of patience or understanding, Nolan responds with the brutal pragmatism that defines his species. If Mark isn't useful as a superhuman asset, then he's worthless as a son. The murder of Debbie isn't portrayed as a moment of rage or loss of control. It's a cold, calculated elimination of what Nolan sees as a failed experiment. Debbie's death serves multiple purposes in Nolan's twisted logic. It removes a human influence that might have softened Mark, eliminates a witness to his abandonment, and sends a clear message that weakness will not be tolerated in his bloodline. Nolan's abandonment of Mark in Midnight City isn't random. It's deliberately chosen as the most hostile environment possible for a powerless child. Midnight City is an urban hellscape where crime runs rampant, where the strong prey upon the weak without consequence, and where a 13-year-old boy without superpowers has virtually no chance of survival. Nolan isn't just leaving Mark, he's sentencing him to death while maintaining plausible deniability about his son's fate. The weeks Mark spends hiding in abandoned buildings represent a crash course in survival that no child should ever endure. He learns to move silently, to avoid detection, to find food in places others wouldn't think to look, and to recognize the difference between genuine threats and empty posturing. Every day becomes a test of his will to live, Every night, a challenge to his hope that someone, somewhere, might care enough to help him. The psychological trauma of this period cannot be overstated. Mark doesn't just experience physical hardship, he experiences the complete destruction of his worldview. Everything he believed about family, safety, and his place in the world has been revealed as illusion. He's forced to confront the reality that the man he worshipped as a hero is actually a monster, and that his mother's love couldn't protect her from his father's brutality. When Darkwing discovers Mark hiding in the abandoned burger mart, he finds more than just a homeless child. He finds a boy whose spirit has been tested by fire and emerged unbroken. Mark hasn't just survived his ordeal, he's adapted to it, developing skills and instincts that most adults never acquire. There's something in the boy's eyes that tells Darkwing this isn't a victim who needs rescuing, but a survivor who needs guidance. This universe's Darkwing is fundamentally different from his canon counterpart. His decision to remain a reclusive vigilante rather than joining the Guardians stems from a deep distrust of organized heroism and a belief that true justice can only be achieved by those willing to work outside the system. His jaded worldview makes him the perfect mentor for a boy who has already learned that the world is far crueler than most people realize. Darkwing's detective work that reveals Mark's connection to the missing Omni-Man creates a complex dynamic between mentor and student. Darkwing understands that Mark isn't just an abandoned child. He's the son of someone who was supposed to be Earth's greatest protector, but instead became its greatest threat. This knowledge creates both opportunity and danger. Mark has the potential for incredible power, but also the genetic legacy of betrayal and violence. The training relationship that develops between Darkwing and Mark is unlike any traditional superhero mentorship. Darkwing doesn't just teach combat techniques and detective skills, he helps Mark process the trauma of abandonment while building the psychological foundation necessary for heroism. He shows Mark that strength doesn't come from superpowers, but from the choice to protect those who can't protect themselves. Mark's gradual power development creates unique challenges for both mentor and student. Unlike canon Mark, who had Nolan's guidance in understanding and controlling his abilities, Markwing must learn to manage superhuman strength while maintaining the stealth and subtlety that define effective vigilante work. His powers become tools in a larger arsenal rather than the primary focus of his heroic identity. The decision to hide his true capabilities stems from Mark's deep-seated fear of becoming like his father. He associates overwhelming power with the capacity for cruelty and abandonment, so he deliberately limits himself to prevent that transformation. This self-imposed restraint actually makes him more effective as a street-level hero, as he learns to solve problems through intelligence and creativity rather than brute force. The vigilante work in Midnight City provides Mark with a sense of purpose that helps counteract the trauma of his abandonment. Every criminal he stops, every victim he saves, every small victory against the forces of darkness becomes proof that he is nothing like his father. He's not just fighting crime, he's fighting the legacy of cruelty that Nolan left behind. Mark's refusal to fully embrace his Viltrumite heritage creates an interesting parallel with his father's rejection of humanity. Where Nolan saw human values as weakness to be overcome, Mark sees Viltrumite power as corruption to be resisted. Both characters are defined by their rejection of part of their nature, but Mark chooses to embrace the better aspects of his dual heritage while Nolan embraced the worst. The partnership between Darkwing and Markwing becomes legendary in Midnight City's criminal underworld. They represent something new, a combination of human detective skills and superhuman capabilities that makes them nearly unstoppable. But more importantly, they prove that heroism can emerge from the darkest circumstances if someone is willing to choose compassion over cruelty. Mark's journey from abandoned child to capable hero demonstrates that family isn't defined by genetics or circumstances of birth, but by the bonds we choose to form and maintain. Darkwing becomes the father figure that Nolan never was. Someone who guides through example rather than force, who builds up rather than tears down, who proves that true strength comes from protecting others rather than dominating them. The tragedy of Markwing is that he never truly grasps his full potential because he's too afraid of what that potential might make him become. His greatest strength, his moral restraint, is also his greatest limitation. He represents the question of whether it's better to be a limited hero who never risks becoming a monster, or a powerful protector who must constantly guard against their own capacity for destruction. These fan-made takes prove heroism comes from choices and environment, not just powers. Stay tuned for more. Which variant shocked you most? Comment below and subscribe for more dives into Mark Grayson's endless possibilities.